Hey guys, Dread here. I just wanted to say thank you to all of those that have let me narrate their stories today. This first one comes from Lauren-Aaron on Reddit. My little sister isn't a missing person anymore because somebody else came home in her place. I know I should have been ecstatic. My mother's eyes swam with gratitude, and yet mine were always cast to the ground, burning holes into canyon-ridden patches of carpet we refused to clean. We'd barely dared to dream during those silent dinners without Willow, the jarring sound of clumsy cutlery echoing through our now-too-empty house. Conversation seeming pointless without her skipping around the dinner table, begging for the attention I gave her too little of, thumbs ghosting over my phone instead. I want to reach back in time and wrench my head from my shoulders when I think of her begging to show me a cartwheel, watching myself roll my eyes instead of grabbing her up and memorizing her face, because she would be dead soon. Days of torture turned to weeks, and Willow Hartfield was gone, lost to some place only our terrible imaginations could conjure up. She was dead, but we were ghosts, haunting our own house with pale apparitions of ourselves, eating to live and speaking only to fill the silence. She was color, and the world redrew itself in black and white for the three of us. Life was over, until it wasn't. Because Willow Hartfield, 704 days later, was found. It's what the news said, what was splashed across the national paper and beyond. It was what they uttered in incredulous tones on the podcasts and what the mayor of our town boomed into his microphone. It's what my parents choked out in desperate, relieved sobs I'd never heard fill our house up before. It seemed I was the only naysayer staring into this girl's eyes and knowing with every fiber of my being that this was not my Willow sitting cross-legged on our family sofa. She looked like her, eerily so, but it was off. It was wrong. Her chin a little too pointy, her gaze a little too cold. She was not my bright, bubbly little sister dressed head to toe in pink. But she said she was. She said it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes which sparkled just a shade or two off Willow's. Her voice was a semitone lower, but that's because it's been 2 years, and voices change, my mother insisted. Her chin-length hair now flowed far past her shoulders in that same chocolate hue, a length Willow would gasp at if she saw. This stranger wandered straight into our house, pulled on my sister's 2 small clothes, and played pretend, pulling the strings on everyone but me. The first night was something out of a horror movie, the heaviest sense of dread settling like lead in my stomach. Bile rose into my throat as she skipped into the living room, settling herself in Willow's seat and tugging impatiently at the hem of my sister's favorite dress. I'd bought it for her on a spontaneous shopping trip, watching her eyes light up at all the little sunflowers lining the collar. She'd been giddy, and now a stranger's fingernails dug into the fabric, leaving marks I'd never get rid of. No longer would that little dress smell like Willow, because it was going to smell like her. "Come to the table," my mother insisted in a too jovial tone, eyes more alight than I'd seen them in years. My father nodded a silent agreement, perhaps a bit more muted than she was, and I had to swallow down my fury, my confusion. I had to. 6 eyes bore into mine, and the chair scraped as I sat down, and this wasn't my sister. She stared over her plate at me with a hollow smile, eyes devoid of any real emotion. Her fingers drummed on the mahogany, a disjointed rhythm I'd never heard, despite sitting across from my sister for 9 years. "I missed you." Her words were sickly sweet, head tilted slightly to the side. Her gaze felt almost challenging, but my mother's eyes brimmed with tears as she nodded vigorously, fork hanging in midair. "Oh gosh, you wouldn't believe." She gulped her words down, overwhelmed. "You've dreamed of a family dinner, haven't you, love?" She regarded me almost desperately, fingers trembling. And I had, of course. I'd cried 1,000 tears for my baby sister, but the girl swinging her leg inches from mine, sitting in my sister's clothes, was not the girl I'd sobbed for. When her foot brushed mine accidentally, thousands of goosebumps erupted over my skin because I knew it was wrong. "I'd love to hear where you've been," I dared whisper into the silence. My mother gasped, fork clattering noisily onto her plate. Detective Matthews said, "Yeah, and if Willow ever turns up, I'll keep quiet about it," I snapped, eyeing this wild animal before me. She sucked in a mighty breath, and I swore I felt her gaze prickle me, but it was only seconds before her eyes became doe-like, wide and comical. "I don't want to talk about it," she uttered sadly, looking to my mother for reassurance. Her lip quivered, hands shook. It was almost laughable how overzealous her performance was, and yet my father admonished me, snapping at me to leave while my mother gathered up the intruder in her arms, clutching at her so she'd never leave. I watched the family before me, new and being invented before my eyes. As I left, she smirked right at me. Nobody believed me, not on the second day when I walked in and saw her doing perfect cartwheels in the living room, something Willow had been utterly hopeless at. She must have learned my mother chirped, scrubbing dishes so vigorously I swore she was leaving cracks. Nobody blinked on the third day when she locked herself in the bathroom and claimed to be too sick to head to the station to kickstart the rigorous medical testing. But it was the fourth night that haunted my dreams, driving me even closer to the edge I'd been dancing along. I'd largely managed to avoid her, other than the odd, lingering gaze as we crossed paths in the hallway, or a wry smile as we brushed shoulders. Until there she was, at 2 a.m., standing over me as I slept. I didn't scream, didn't startle her into dropping her soulless smile as she gazed upon me, staring straight down mere inches from my face. So close I could feel her hot breath on my nose, feeling the animosity coming off her in waves. She didn't move when I clocked her, didn't take a step back or pretend to be doing anything other than pressing her face into mine in the dead of the night. "Why are you here?" I whispered, and we both knew I meant more than standing in my room. She laughed, a little giggle I'd never heard leave Willow's mouth. "I wanted to come home, silly," she hissed back, breath tickling my cheek horribly. I swallowed, desperate not to show the fear which was beginning to course through me. "You aren't Willow," I gritted my teeth, and only then did she pull back a little, mock hurt lining her features. "That's a shame," she frowned. "You're my favorite big sister." My hands trembled under the covers. "And how many sisters have you had?" She paused then, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Oh, lots." I don't think I've ever felt as unsafe in my life as I did in that moment, watching her eyes glimmer with something truly evil, a sick sort of pride. I didn't find my voice for a long time, but when I did, it was small and timid, a shadow of my confidence from only hours earlier. "And what do you want with us?" She thought of it for a moment, tilting her head back and forth as though the question was funny. Even in the dark, she looked wrong, as though someone had built her to look like my beloved Willow and misremembered her slightly, getting the angles and details wrong. She lay her fingers on my forehead, painfully drumming that same pattern on my skin as all those days ago. Shamefully, I was too scared to move, even as her fingers jammed into my skull. "I like your mom," she mused, giggling childishly as she caught her mistake. "Our mom. I think she's going to like me more than your sister." But before I could react, she was gone, skipping towards the door in the wrong night clothes, only turning back to casually ruin my life. "She's dead, by the way," she murmured into the silence, shrugging. "It was painful, too. Sorry for your loss." And she left, leaving me aghast as I festered in my blanket, desperately grabbing Willow's teddy bear from beside my bed and clutching it to my chest. I sobbed myself to sleep that night, face buried in her favorite toy, and knowing for sure that she was never coming home. It only got worse. One day, I came home and my father wouldn't speak, only managing to stare at his new daughter as she smirked at him from the shadow of Willow's bedroom. He startled at me in the hallway, scurrying back into his study. When I called for him, he shook his head. "Hang out with your friends. Go back outside," he ordered, voice cracking. He slammed the door behind him, and that was that. I was left to stare into Willow's room, locking gazes with a pair of beady eyes sneering at me from under the bed. When I tried to speak to my mother, she grew more and more irate, once physically covering my mouth with her hand. "Mom, please, she isn't who she..." But she muffled my words out of existence with a trembling hand, sending me a subtle no with a quick shake of the head. She pleaded towards me with eyes, but I realized quickly that her steely gaze had fallen behind me. I didn't need to see the parasite in my peripheral to feel her gaze burning holes into the back of my head. And I wasn't imagining it. My mother was fearful, finally turning back to me with a steely resolve. "Everything is fine," she murmured, speaking 1,000 words with only her eyes and voice dropping to a whisper. "We will make it work." That night, the stranger wearing my sister's favorite bracelet gleefully pushed a piece of paper to the center of the dining table, eyes lit up with glee. "I drew us," she cried, greedily watching for our reactions. My mother gave nothing away, only visibly swallowing as she drank in the paper, white-knuckled grip on her spoon. My father stood from his seat, striding from the table, and slamming the front door behind him as he left us, perhaps for the last time. I, however, dared pick it up, regarding every horrific line and frantic scratching before me. It was us, except the people labeled Mummy and Daddy were standing without heads, rivers of blood dripping down their torn torsos. My double sat in the corner of the paper, a pair of gouged-out eyes lying on the floor next to my terrified frame. Our stranger stood smiling with a large rake in her hand, head bent to the side and wearing my sister's dress. But somehow, worst of all, was the picture of a little girl crumpled in the corner, a frown etched upon her face. "Willow," the scrawl above her stated, and I could hardly bear it. I don't remember much of it now, just the screaming and crying, lifting whatever wasn't nailed down and hurling it across the room, watching it splinter into 1,000 pieces. My mother, cradling me as she dragged me upstairs, letting me bawl into her familiar, sweet-smelling cardigan, clutching her as though she'd leave me too. The swirling wrongness engulfing our house, swallowing us back into the clutches of grief. But my all-encompassing comfort disappeared because when that horrible little thing downstairs called a desperate, "Mummy," my mother went rigid. "You don't have to go," I pleaded through bleary eyes, but her sad smile told me that she did. "I prayed 2 years ago for my baby girl to come home," she said in a thick voice, clutching my hands as if begging me to understand. I'll always wish I tried harder to keep her in that room with me, because the moment I loosened my grasp, I sealed her fate. The thing downstairs called, and she offered me a sad smile, fingers brushing mine before she disappeared through the darkness of the door. I never saw her again. Before my eyes closed and sleep claimed me, I saw the head of Willow's beloved bear discarded on the floor across the room, 3 feet from its body. My heart sank into my stomach, and I drifted off into nightmares, feeling somehow it was all over. When I awoke, slick with sweat and dread, she was there in the darkest corner of my room, almost Willow. Nighttime shrouded her, but I could see the blood, even in the dim light. Something glinted in her hand under the glow of moonlight, and her eyes blazed with something bigger than the both of us. It's been 12 minutes and she hasn't moved. Her relentless, empty stare locked onto me as she sways back and forth. I know that the second I move, she's going to lunge. Somehow, I know that's what Mom did. That's why it's so quiet now, because I am utterly alone, and when I hold my breath, I think I hear the shift of fabric. Yes, she's definitely closer to me than she was 5 seconds ago. If I squint, I see her feet shuffling towards me, in time with my breathing. It's over, I'm sure, but somehow, every second that passes, I feel closer to my sister, the real one. Not the one charging at me now, face contorted in bloody, evil glee. This next story comes from Jackson_1414_ on Reddit. Gas station horror story. For a bit of context, I work at a gas station in the backwoods of Tennessee, and that's where this happened. Last night when I clocked in at 8, the store was completely dead. Actually, it used to be up until about a decade ago when a new freeway was built. This led basically every business that was here to pack up and leave their old building abandoned. Thanks to this, there are a lot of abandoned buildings on this stretch of road that local druggies tend to claim as their own. Anyways, at around 11, I only had an hour left of my shift, and so I figured I should actually get some work done instead of just sitting around and doing nothing. I'm 18, and so I work the shift alone, which is nice because it means I can do pretty much whatever I want. This is normally pretty great because I can do whatever I want as long as I get what I need to get done finished. I noticed we were almost out of barbecue chips, and so I'd need to go get them from our storage space, which is for some reason in the basement of the station. I've always hated going down there just because it gives me the creeps. Why the owner decided to store everything down there is beyond my comprehension. I got about halfway down the steps before something fell on the other side of the room, and it sounded like footsteps were coming my way. I sprinted up the stairs and locked the door to the basement, panicking like a madman the entire time. When I got back upstairs, I went behind the counter to the store computer so I could check the security cameras. I flicked over to the one that looks into the basement, and there was this guy just standing there, smiling up into the camera. He had a look of absolute insanity in his eyes, but he didn't look like the average junkie in the area. He was clean-shaven and dressed in what looked to be jeans and a button-up of some kind. Honestly, if he'd walked into the store, I wouldn't have batted an eye. But, because he was down there, and because he was just looking into the camera smiling, it shook me to my core. I called the store owner, and at first he was pretty mad I called him in the middle of the night, but once he'd heard how freaked out I was, his tone changed. He told me he'd be there in 15 minutes, and just to lock the main door to the store and make sure the man didn't go anywhere. I asked if I should call the police, but for some reason he didn't want me to do that. I locked the entrance to the gas station and went back to looking at the man. He was still there, just smiling up at me. About 3 or so minutes of him staring at me later, and he walked out of view of the camera. My boss showed up soon after, armed with a shotgun, and when I let him in, he immediately went to the basement. I went with him just because I felt safe with there being another person there and all, but we found nothing. My boss ultimately chalked this up for me being tired and hallucinating the man, but I know what I saw. This has me scared out of my mind as I clock back into work in a few hours, and I'm really dreading it. Sorry for rambling, but I just needed to get this off my chest, as it scared me to my core.
Sorry for the interruption, folks. I've just been handed something by one of my flight attendants. Of course. How could I forget this? Looks like I've missed someone on my flight manifest. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to EXO. Without him, this program wouldn't be possible. You can find him on Twitch at Wyvern's Wraith. Now back to it. Watch out for any unexpected turbulence, folks.
This last story comes from OKProgrammer6938 on Reddit. The gray men don't like you. I grew up an only child, and the one thing I had always wanted as a kid was a sibling. It's weird, but I had this strong drive to be a mentor. So, at around 16, I decided to start a babysitting service. It wasn't anything crazy, but I made decent money, and ended up with a few repeat clients. One of them was Maddie. Maddie was a 6-year-old girl with a pair of affluent, artsy parents. They often called me to their big house on the outskirts of town so they could attend their openings and gallery parties. Like a lot of kids, Maddie had imaginary friends. Her parents encouraged them, though. They called it a great way for a little girl to express her creativity. They also said, "She's creating whole people out of nothing. She has quite a future in the art world, don't you think?" I suppose it was good her parents cared about her, but I had read that encouraging delusions were dangerous. When I said as much to them once, I got a look that suggested I refrain from saying such things if I wanted to stay employed. So, I kept my mouth shut and have since kept one of my best returning clients. Maddie was a wonderful child to work with. She was smart, observant, and incredibly talented. She also had amazing manners, never screamed or cried, and always had a word of kindness to offer anyone in her home. In all honesty, Maddie was the real reason I kept working as a babysitter for so long. A lot of my other clients' kids were nightmares. I looked after Maddie for about a year without incident. Her parents loved calling me because I was always willing to work. I had even ended up staying over a few times to watch Maddie over the weekend. They'd call to check in, of course, but they wouldn't come home until late Sunday night or early Monday morning. We'd play games, color, draw, tell each other stories, and I'd help her if she had any schoolwork or the like she needed to get done. One day while we were playing, I saw a small group of chairs set out by the wall, facing what we were doing. "Hey, Maddie, did you leave those chairs out?" I asked curiously. "Uh-huh. They like it when they can sit and observe," she said plainly, still playing with her doll. "Who are they?" "My friends. They're really nice to me. They don't like Mommy and Daddy that much, though. They think they're stupid." "Maddie, you can't say that sort of thing about your parents," I scolded. "I didn't. They did." I frowned and shook my head. I couldn't tell Maddie her friends weren't real, or her parents would never hire me again. So I sighed and we simply kept playing, but I'd spare a glance over to those chairs every now and again. Something about them made my stomach drop, like something was very wrong there. That night, as I was putting Maddie to bed, she lay there, combing her doll's hair with her hand. "They don't like you either," she said flatly. "They said you don't think they're real." I paused as I was tucking her in. "Who said that?" "My friends. The gray men." "The gray men?" She nodded, still looking at her doll. "The gray men don't like you. They said they're going to take care of you, that you won't be a problem anymore. I told them you're not, but they told me it was okay, and that would all be okay soon." Before this, I had only ever heard Maddie offhandedly mention her imaginary friends, but they all had names. She just called those ones the gray men. I glanced about the room, looking for something to help me understand this, and I saw the chairs again. They were closer to the bed, still in a perfect row. How did I miss these before? Were they like that when I was putting Maddie to bed? Turning my focus to her again, I asked, "Maddie, what do the gray men look like?" She sat up and reached into her nightstand, pulling out a few sheets of paper she had colored on. "Like this," she said, handing them to me. The first drawing was of 5 figures sitting in 5 chairs. Their forms, while vaguely humanoid, were completely gray. I flipped to the second. 2 people were on their knees, coloring, while the strange gray figures hovered over them. It looked like their necks were bent down, almost as though they were watching the happenings beneath them. My breath caught in my throat as I flipped to the last picture. There was a person laying on the ground. The gray figures had them surrounded. Their hands were outstretched. It looked like they were drawn with claws that were dripping with blood. "Maddie, this last picture, it's just a drawing, silly. The gray men told me to do it. They said it would look really neat," she declared with a yawn. "I'm going to sleep now. Good night." I offered a nervous chuckle and gave her a pat on the head. "Yeah, of course. Have a good night, Maddie. Rest well." As I closed the door to her room, I held up the last drawing again. "What the heck?" I murmured. My eyes drifted to the clock. It looked like Maddie's parents would be home in an hour. I'd show them the last picture then. Maybe they could talk to her about it. Maybe they'd understand what feeding the delusion could do. I folded the picture and tucked it into my back pocket. Then I made my way downstairs to watch some TV while I waited. I must have fallen asleep with the TV on, and when I woke I could hear Maddie's parents fumbling with the keys. As I wiped the sleep from my eyes, I stopped dead in my tracks. The chairs from the kitchen were sitting in a perfect row. Before I could respond, the door opened, and Maddie's parents entered. "Oh, the show was such a bore, we're home. So good to see you." I was given a hug by Maddie's mother and another by Maddie's father. I was thanked, paid. As I was trying to explain what had happened, I was interrupted and ushered out the door. I wish I had talked to them about it. I wish I had done anything to prevent what happened, because to this day, I have no explanation for it. When I got home, my parents had left a note saying they'd be gone for the weekend. It was nothing new. I was 17 and they trusted me to look after the house while they were gone. I wish they hadn't this weekend, especially after the weird night I had. I sighed and headed inside. What I needed was a hot shower and a good night of rest. So I made my way upstairs and into my bathroom, started the shower, and let the heat calm my shattered nerves. When I got out of the shower, something caught my eye in the mirror. The bathroom door was opened. I thought I had closed it. In fact, I was certain. Cautiously, I approached and opened the door. I must have heard something slide because I took a step back, and I'm glad I did. A knife fell from the top of the door and clattered onto the bathroom tile in front of me. I paused, looking at the kitchen utensil before slowly stepping out around it. I quickly glanced about the hallway, looking for any sign of what might have caused this, but I saw nothing. "Hello?" I called out, doubling back, picking up the knife, and cautiously stepping from the bathroom. The house seemed normal, nothing was out of the ordinary, but my stomach was doing backflips. I was being watched. I could feel it. As I slowly moved through the house, I said nothing else. If there was some kind of intruder, they weren't going to get the drop on me. I crept into the kitchen, knife in hand, but I dropped it as soon as I entered. 5 chairs sat in the kitchen in a perfect row. They weren't chairs from my house like they were at Maddie's. They were different. They looked old and rotting, like they had been sitting out in the rain for years to decay. "What the heck?" I murmured under my breath. Reaching back down for the knife, as I collected it, a sound drew my eyes under the table. There, crouched among the tiny forest of chair legs, was a creature. It wore no clothes. Skin was this molting of shades of gray that seemed to seep into each other and blend like water and paint. It stared at me with the tiny pinprick holes for eyes and its face that sucked inward when it blinked. It didn't move toward me, it just stared. Eyes locked on the strange thing, I slowly picked up the knife and scooted away. As I rose, I was greeted by the sight of 4 more of those things sitting in the old rotten chairs, just staring. They had no mouths or necks. Their heads just sort of molded into their bodies. Their arms had no elbows, and they had no discernible hands, just strange little nubs. Their feet were the same, kneeless and without feet, like a child's clay sculpture of a person. These weird facsimiles didn't move towards me. They didn't really move at all, save for the strange sucking blinks of their holes for eyes. Nervously, I raised the knife and spoke. You guys must be the Greymen," I choked out. Welcome to my home?" They still said nothing. They just stared. I could feel their gaze even if I couldn't see their eyes. That wasn't all I felt. The sinking feeling in my gut was stronger now. It was like I could feel the rage and hate permeating off of them. I'm sorry if I offended you in any way. It wasn't my intention." Still, they said nothing, staring at me with those stoic, beady little eyes. I backed away, slowly raising the knife to my chest defensively, never taking my eyes off of the 4 I could see in the kitchen. That was when the 5th must have tripped me. I stumbled backward, landing hard on my back and striking my head against the linoleum. Sparks rocketed through my vision, and as the world teetered between the light and the dark, I saw their forms move into my vision. Weakly, I shook the cobwebs away, and I could see them clearly. Their pinprick eyes had developed a new feature. Eyebrows slanted down in a sort of angry glare. They stood over me as I slowly reached behind my head to feel something warm and sticky. Bringing my hand back into view, I noticed I was bleeding. The Greymen didn't move. They just kept watching. I tried to push myself up, but something sharp poked into my shoulder, forcing me back down. One of the Greymen moved into my vision, its strange, ever-shifting, monochromatic skin blocking the rest of the house from my field of view. It pressed its strange nub of a hand into my forehead, and slowly pulled it away. I want to say what happened next was like a punch, but it felt like getting hit with a sack of wet towels. The creature jerked its hand back and slammed it into my face, and while its attack didn't really cause any damage, my head bounced off the tile again. I cried out, but before I could react in any other way, it struck me again. The world flashed white, my ears started ringing, and suddenly it felt like I was drifting away from my own body as this thing punched me again and again. I don't know how many times that weird little creature struck me. I just know that I blacked out around the 6th. When I came to, I was still lying in the kitchen, the floor now stained with my blood. I rose weakly and rubbed my head, looking around for any sign of the Greymen. Their chairs were gone, and so were they. I was left alone in my house once again, wondering if anything I had just experienced was real. I went back up to the bathroom to get my phone, which I had stupidly left in my pants. It was sitting on the bathroom counter, and my pants were gone, along with the pictures of the Greymen that Maddie had drawn. Was that what this was about? Is that why they didn't like me? I told Maddie's parents her imaginary friends weren't real, so some of them came and beat me up, Just writing that makes me feel like I'm crazy. I was at the point where I didn't care if her parents didn't believe me anymore. I wasn't going back to that house. I called an ambulance and told them I had fallen. I was seen for minor concussion and recovered after a few weeks. My parents felt terrible for leaving me alone. They blamed themselves, said I could have died. Maddie's parents called me the day after the incident to see if I was alright and told me to take some time to recover. After I told them I wouldn't do any more babysitting, that I was closing up shop to pursue other interests. Surprisingly, they were understanding, but there are times I still think about Maddie in those chairs. I wonder if anyone else ever experienced anything like that. I wonder how you'd fight it. Could you? I didn't even think at the time, and in some ways I hate myself a little for that, but I still don't even know if what happened to me was real. The only piece of evidence I still have is the doctor's notes on the incident. They had mentioned bits of dried, gray clay in my hair.
Well, you've reached the end. It has been nice talking to you, my friend. Are you going to view once more, or see what else I have in store?